No one remembered when Ifunanya Okafor first appeared in the city. That was deliberate. She moved the way people do when they've learned that attention carries a price. Head slightly lowered. Steps measured. Clothes chosen for practicality, not notice. She spoke politely, briefly, and never when silence would do the job better. Ifunanya understood something most people learn too late. Visibility was not the same as safety. Every day followed a pattern. Leave early. Return late. Stay unremarkable in places where being seen invited questions, and questions invited consequences. She kept her world narrow on purpose. Routines were easier to control than people. Silence was easier to manage than explanation. To everyone else, she was just another woman passing through crowded streets, offices, hallways that forgot faces as quickly as they registered them. Nothing about her demanded attention. And that was exactly how she survived. What Ifunanya did not know was that Choi Kang-ho had already noticed the disruption. Kang-ho did not rule his world with noise or spectacle. His power came from restraint, from watching instead of reacting, from understanding that the smallest deviation often carried the greatest threat. He noticed patterns the way others noticed danger, early, quietly, without urgency. He saw it in the way she moved. Not fear. Not weakness. Control under pressure. The kind that suggested someone used to navigating risk without ever naming it. People like that didn't cross paths with men like him by accident. Their encounter was insignificant on the surface. A moment that should have dissolved into the background of the city's endless motion. No raised voices. No confrontation. Nothing anyone else would remember. Except Kang-ho did. And that was the mistake. Because once he acknowledged her, once he chose to intervene instead of ignore, something shifted. Not in her world first, but in his. Power that had always moved cleanly suddenly met resistance. Loyalty cracked where it had never bent. Eyes that had always looked outward began to turn inward. Ifunanya did not ask to be protected. Kang-ho did not intend to be exposed. But silence, once broken, does not return quietly. This is not a story about fate or romance or salvation. It is a story about cost. About what happens when a woman who survives by staying unseen crosses the path of a man whose strength depends on never being distracted, and how noticing her becomes the most expensive decision he has ever made. Ifunanya Okafor learned early how to take up less space than she occupied. It showed in the way she walked, never rushed, never lingering, always aware of who moved around her and how close they came. Her shoulders stayed relaxed on purpose, her expression neutral enough to pass without comment. She dressed for function, not disguise, choosing clothes that blended into whatever room she entered, fabrics that didn't demand to be noticed, colors that didn't ask questions. Mornings were precise. Wake before the city stirred. Leave before crowds thickened. She preferred streets just beginning to fill, when people were still half inside themselves, not yet curious about others. She learned which routes kept her moving without interruption, which corners invited delay. It wasn't fear that guided her. It was calculation. Ifunanya understood systems. She understood how attention worked, how it gathered and lingered, how it rarely landed evenly. She had watched what happened to people who were seen too clearly, too often. Questions followed. Assumptions. Expectations. Sometimes worse. Silence, on the other hand, allowed movement. Silence let you pass through without leaving a mark. At work, she was reliable in a way that discouraged scrutiny. Early enough to be counted. Quiet enough to be forgotten. Her work spoke cleanly, efficiently, without flourish. She didn't compete for credit. She didn't correct people publicly, even when she knew she was right. Precision, she had learned, didn't require visibility. Colleagues described her kindly, vaguely. Professional, polite, hardworking. No one could have said exactly when she joined or what she did outside her assigned tasks. She answered questions directly and never offered more than was asked. If someone lingered near her desk, she waited patiently for the conversation to end. If they asked how she was, she smiled and said fine, because fine closed doors without slamming them. Lunches were solitary by design. She ate when others were distracted, choosing corners where she could see entrances without appearing to watch them. Movement drew attention. Stillness passed unnoticed. When the day ended, she left with the same quiet intention she had arrived, slipping back into the city as if it had been waiting to absorb her. At home, her apartment was orderly, sparse, intentional. Nothing unnecessary. Nothing sentimental left in the open. She believed in control not because it promised safety but because it reduced variables. Fewer variables meant fewer surprises. Fewer surprises meant fewer costs. Some nights, when the city pressed too close against the windows, she felt the weight of what she was holding back. The words she never spoke. The questions she never asked. The moments she let pass because they asked too much of her. She acknowledged those thoughts briefly, the way one acknowledges pain before setting it aside. By morning they were gone. Ifunanya adjusted her posture, smoothed her expression, and stepped back into the world exactly as she intended. Present, capable, and unnoticed. Choi Kang-ho did not need to announce his presence for it to be felt. Rooms adjusted to him without instruction. Voices softened. Movements slowed just enough to register caution. People straightened their posture, not out of fear exactly, but instinct, an unspoken recognition that something heavier had entered the space. He noticed everything. Not in the obvious way. Not with restless eyes or sharp questions. Kang-ho watched the margins. The pauses between answers. The way people shifted their weight when they lied, or relaxed too quickly when they believed themselves safe. He read rooms the way others read contracts, looking for what wasn't written, for the clause everyone assumed didn't matter until it did. Control had never been about force for him. Force was loud, predictable. Control came from restraint, from knowing when not to act, from allowing others to believe they were choosing freely while never losing sight of where their choices led. His days were structured, deliberate. Meetings that appeared routine but were never wasted. Conversations that sounded casual but were measured for what they revealed. Kang-ho did not rush decisions. He let information settle, let patterns repeat until they confirmed themselves. Impatience, he believed, was the fastest way to lose leverage. People mistook his calm for distance. They were wrong. Distance implied disengagement. Kang-ho was always present, always listening. Power to him was not dominance over others but mastery of consequence. Every action carried weight. Every deviation mattered. He built his empire by noticing small fractures before they became visible breaks. By responding quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. That was why he survived. Loyalty followed him not because he demanded it, but because he rewarded precision. Mistakes were addressed privately. Successes acknowledged without ceremony. Fear had its place, but it was never allowed to be the foundation. Fear eroded judgment. Kang-ho preferred clarity. He trusted few people fully. Not out of paranoia but understanding. Trust was an investment, and he did not spend recklessly. Those within his inner circle knew one thing for certain. If Kang-ho was watching, nothing escaped notice. If he said nothing, it was because he had already seen enough. On the surface, his life moved smoothly, predictably. He occupied spaces designed for men like him. High floors, controlled environments, conversations that never drifted where he did not allow them. His world responded to him with consistency, and consistency was power's most useful ally. And yet, even in that precision, Kang-ho remained alert to disruption. He noticed it in patterns that broke without explanation, in behavior that did not match its environment, in people who moved through systems without seeking advantage, without demanding recognition. Those were the ones worth watching, not because they were threats, but because they didn't behave like everyone else. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous shifts never announced themselves. They arrived quietly, unremarkable, easy to dismiss. Kang-ho never dismissed anything. So when something crossed his awareness that did not belong, something controlled, careful, deliberately unseen, he did what he always did. He observed. And waited. It happened on a day that gave no warning. The city moved as it always did. Measured, impatient, absorbed in its own momentum. People flowed around one another without contact, each intent on arriving somewhere else. Ifunanya stepped into that movement the way she always did, adjusting her pace to match the current, neither resisting nor drawing ahead. She had learned how to pass through moments without claiming them. The space where it happened was transitional, not a destination. A place designed for passing, not pausing. She was aware of her surroundings without focusing on any one thing. Attention diffused just enough to register shifts without inviting engagement. Then something changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to disrupt the rhythm she relied on. Someone moved where they shouldn't have. A hesitation where there should have been certainty. The smallest fracture in the flow. Ifunanya adjusted instinctively, stepping aside to avoid collision. Her body responding before her thoughts caught up. It was a reflex built from years of quiet correction. Choi Kang-ho saw it. He wasn't looking for her. He rarely looked for anyone. His attention had been elsewhere, tracking a conversation that no longer interested him, evaluating a presence that had already revealed too much. But disruption registered automatically. His gaze shifted, precise and immediate. He noticed the restraint first. The way she yielded space instead of claiming it. The absence of irritation, entitlement, urgency. People usually reacted when their path was obstructed. They bristled. They asserted. They corrected others with words or posture. She did neither. She simply adjusted, as if inconvenience were expected. Their eyes met for less than a second. Should have ended there. But in that brief contact, Kang-ho saw control layered over vigilance. Not fear. Awareness. The kind that didn't belong in moments meant to be forgettable. She looked at him the way someone looks at a changing environment. Measuring, not judging. Not seeking permission. Not seeking anything at all. Most people looked at him with intent. Curiosity. Calculation. Deference. She looked through him just long enough to confirm he existed, then moved on. That was the mistake. Kang-ho did not follow her. He did not speak. He did not interrupt the rhythm she so carefully maintained. He remained exactly where he was, still and observant, as the city swallowed her again. But something had already shifted. The moment replayed, not as memory but as anomaly. Something that did not align with the patterns he trusted. People who moved like that did so for a reason. And reasons always carried consequence. Ifunanya continued on, unaware that the cost of that adjustment had not yet been calculated. To her, it was nothing more than another avoided collision. Another quiet correction in a day built of them. To Kang-ho it was a deviation. Contained. Irreversible. And once noticed, it could not be unseen. The first sign came quietly. Ifunanya noticed it in the way familiar routes no longer felt neutral. Pause that lingered half a second too long. A presence where there had never been one before. Nothing overt enough to confirm suspicion, but enough to unsettle the balance she relied on. Safety, she had learned, was often defined by predictability. And something had begun to shift. She adjusted as she always did. Changed timing. Altered path. Paid closer attention without appearing to. The discipline held. For a moment it seemed sufficient. It wasn't. Choi Kang-ho did not approach her again. He did not summon her or place himself deliberately in her way. His protection did not arrive as contact. It arrived as absence. Doors that opened more easily than before. Interactions that ended without explanation. Obstacles that dissolved before they could form. Ifunanya felt it before she understood it. Things moved around her now. Early. Intentionally. The city, once indifferent, began to make room. She was not stopped. She was not questioned. But she was no longer simply passing through. Protection, she realized, was not invisible. People noticed when systems adjusted. When patterns bent. When someone moved through spaces without friction that others still encountered. Attention gathered not because she asked for it, but because it followed disruption. And disruption, however quiet, attracted interest. She saw it in glances that lingered a fraction too long, in conversations that paused when she entered a room, in the way neutrality gave way to assessment. Curiosity was not concern. It was calculation. Ifunanya kept her head down, but the ground beneath her no longer felt level. Kang-ho was aware of the shift immediately. He had expected it. Protection was never neutral. It announced itself through consequence. Through the way others began to look closer, question more carefully. He accepted the cost without hesitation. What he did not expect was how quickly attention turned. It did not come from the obvious places. Not from rivals who thrived on spectacle or confrontation. It came from quieter corners. From those who understood leverage and waited patiently for it to appear. To them, protection signaled value. And value invited interest. Questions began to circulate. Who was she? Why her? What deviation had warranted intervention? Kang-ho answered none of them. Silence in his world was not avoidance. It was control. But silence also sharpened curiosity. And curiosity rarely stayed contained. Ifunanya felt the pressure building without being able to name it. The instinct that had kept her safe for years began to strain under unfamiliar weight. She had wanted safety without dependence. What she felt now was neither. Being unseen had once been her shield. Now, being protected had made her visible. And visibility, she knew, came with a price she had never agreed to pay. Neither of them had miscalculated. But both were beginning to understand the same truth from opposite sides of power. Safety was no longer quiet. And attention, once drawn, did not retreat. The first fracture appeared where no one expected it. Not in open defiance or sudden betrayal, but in hesitation. Delay in response time. A decision deferred instead of executed. Choi Kang-ho noticed it immediately. He always did. His world had been built on precision, on the quiet assurance that when he moved, the structure followed without resistance. Now something hesitated. Meetings that once resolved cleanly stretched longer than necessary. Questions surfaced that had already been answered. People who understood his expectations began to check them against something else. An unspoken recalculation of risk. Kang-ho did not confront it. He observed. Weakness, when exposed too early, learned how to hide. Rumors traveled faster than facts. They took shape in low voices and indirect phrasing, in glances exchanged when his name was mentioned alongside hers. No one said it openly, but the implication settled into place. Kang-ho had deviated. And deviation, no matter how controlled, suggested vulnerability. His enemies did not rush. They never did. Those who survived in his orbit understood patience. They watched for confirmation, for repetition. One anomaly could be dismissed. Pattern could not. Protection had drawn attention. Attention had drawn assessment. Ifunanya felt none of this directly, but its weight pressed into her days all the same. The city no longer merely adjusted around her. It reacted. Spaces felt tighter. Familiar neutrality was replaced with watchfulness. She recognized the shift instinctively. It was the same feeling she had learned to trust long ago, the sense that silence was no longer enough. She began to see faces twice. Not the same people exactly, but the same type of attention. Measured. Impersonal. Curious in a way that stripped warmth from observation. She did not change her routine. Change invited confirmation. Instead, she refined it. Reduced exposure. Minimized deviation. Control, she reminded herself, was still possible. Kang-ho understood the calculus she was performing even without seeing it. He adjusted his own movements accordingly. Strengthened certain alliances. Removed others from positions where hesitation could metastasize. Power, he knew, did not collapse all at once. It eroded at pressure points. His task was not to react, but to stabilize without signaling retreat. Still, the empire felt different. Not weaker yet, but louder beneath the surface. Too many eyes tracking the same question. Too many minds testing the same boundary. Someone was waiting for him to choose between maintaining control and continuing protection. They believed the choice would expose him. Kang-ho had spent his life ensuring no one ever forced his hand. Now the possibility lingered. Unspoken, undeniable. The woman he had noticed without intention had become a variable no one could ignore. Not because she wielded power, but because power had shifted around her. Ifunanya did not know his enemies by name. She did not need to. She felt their presence in the tightening air, in the way the city seemed to hold its breath. Being unseen had once protected her. Being protected now marked her. And somewhere between those truths, the cracks widened. Not enough to break the empire. Enough to let danger seep through. Ifunanya understood the cost before it was ever named. It arrived in small adjustments that no longer felt like her own. Delayed elevator. Familiar cafe suddenly unavailable. A meeting that ended before she entered the room. Nothing overt enough to accuse. Enough to confirm that her presence now carried weight. Being seen had changed the texture of her days. People did not speak to her differently. That would have been easier to manage. Instead they watched, measured. Their attention slid past politeness and settled somewhere colder. She recognized it immediately. This was not curiosity. It was evaluation. She began to feel outlined by the space around her, as if the city had traced her shape and decided to keep it. Silence, once expansive, grew narrow. The places she used to disappear no longer absorbed her. They reflected her back. First she tried to shrink. She reduced movement. Chose routes with fewer intersections. Kept conversations brief and professional. Control had always been her answer. Control had always worked. But this time restraint did not restore balance. It sharpened the contrast. The attention persisted. It followed her into rooms she did not belong to and lingered just outside the one she did. It pressed into her awareness with the steady insistence of something patient enough to wait. She did not feel hunted. She felt counted. That was worse. Ifunanya stopped one evening before crossing the street she had taken for years. The light changed. People moved. She stayed where she was, listening to the city breathe around her. This was the moment she had always avoided, the one where instinct no longer provided answers. She had not asked to be protected. She had not asked to be noticed. But she could not deny the truth anymore. The protection surrounding her had become a signal, and signals were red. She thought of all the years she had spent perfecting invisibility, of how carefully she had learned to exist without leaving marks. Being seen now felt like standing in borrowed light, warm but exposing, comforting but conditional. When she moved again it was with intention, not habit. She did not run. She did not retreat. She adjusted in a different way. She paid attention to who paid attention. She allowed herself to recognize patterns instead of dismissing them. Survival, she realized, was no longer about disappearance. It was about awareness. Elsewhere, Kang-ho understood the cost she was beginning to feel. Protection had done what protection always did. It shifted risk rather than removed it. The weight that had once rested invisibly on her shoulders had spread outward, touching everything around her. That redistribution was dangerous. Necessary but dangerous. Ifunanya did not know what came next. She only knew that returning to who she had been was no longer possible. Being unseen had kept her safe. Being seen had changed the rules. And whatever price notice demanded, it would no longer be paid quietly. Power did not confront Kang-ho directly. Never had. Challenge arrived instead as resistance wrapped in obedience. Instructions acknowledged but executed too precisely. Agreements honored to the letter while their intent was quietly eroded. People who once anticipated his needs now waited for confirmation they had never required before. Kang-ho felt it as a narrowing. Not a loss of control, but a tightening of margins. The space where authority operated freely began to constrict, forcing choices where there had once been inevitability. He studied the shift without reaction, letting it reveal itself fully. Pressure always exposed alignment. Those closest to him noticed the change in smaller ways. Conversations shortened. Reports grew more cautious. Loyalty, once assumed, became performative. Not because it had vanished, but because it was being tested, by forces patient enough to wait for fracture. Kang-ho allowed it. An empire did not collapse from challenge alone. It collapsed from misjudgment. And he had not misjudged anything yet. What unsettled them was not weakness. It was uncertainty. They did not know how far his protection extended, whether it was temporary, symbolic, or absolute. And uncertainty bred calculation. Calculation bred risk. Whispers circled without names attached. Old alliances resurfaced with new urgency. Someone had begun to count the cost of opposing him, and found the math no longer impossible. Kang-ho did not raise his voice. He did not issue warnings. He adjusted one position, reassigned another. Let a third remain untouched long enough to reveal its intent. Authority did not need to announce itself when it could rearrange outcomes silently. Still, the challenge pressed inward. It forced him to confront a truth he had long controlled with discipline. Power was not static. It required renewal, reinforcement, and sometimes sacrifice. Ifunanya had become a focal point not because he valued her above his empire, but because the empire had reacted to her existence. That reaction exposed fault lines he could no longer ignore. What unsettled his enemies most was not his protection of her. It was the fact that he had not withdrawn it. They expected him to recalibrate, to prioritize balance over disruption, to choose the structure he had built over the variable he had introduced. He did neither. That choice did not weaken him, clarified him. Kang-ho understood then that authority was being tested not from outside, but from within, from those who believed power existed to preserve itself above all else. They had mistaken his restraint for hesitation. They would not make that mistake twice. He moved deliberately, decisively, without spectacle. Lines were drawn without announcement. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was confirmed. And somewhere within that tightening circle of power, Kang-ho accepted the cost he had already begun to pay. Control was no longer effortless. But it was still his. And anyone challenging it would learn the difference between erosion and collapse. The moment arrived without ceremony. No ultimatum was delivered. No warning issued. Kang-ho recognized it the way he recognized everything that mattered. Not through confrontation but through convergence. Too many variables aligned at once. Too many pressures narrowed into a single, unavoidable point. The choice had been forming for days. He saw it in the reports that contradicted each other too cleanly. In the way certain names appeared together more often than coincidence allowed. In the sudden efficiency of people who had once relied on his silence as permission. Control was still intact, but it had become conditional. And conditions were leverage. The path to preserve his authority was clear. Simple even. Distance himself. Remove the variable. Allow the system to settle back into its familiar alignment. No one would question it for long. Empires healed themselves when disruptions were excised quickly. Kang-ho considered it fully. He measured the cost the way he measured everything, without sentiment, without illusion. He knew exactly what it would restore. He also knew exactly what it would confirm. Elsewhere, Ifunanya felt the air shift before she understood why. The pressure that had followed her for weeks sharpened into focus, as if something had finally decided where to land. She did not know the shape of the choice being weighed, only that she stood at its center. She did not ask for help. She had already learned what help cost. Kang-ho stood alone when he decided. No advisors. No witnesses. The room was quiet enough to hear the city breathing beyond the glass. He understood in that stillness that control had always been his shield. It had protected him from chaos, from attachment, from consequence. Protection, however, was different. Protection required exposure. He made the call. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to be irreversible. Instructions were issued that could not be misinterpreted. Positions shifted that could not be undone quietly. Lines were crossed deliberately, in full awareness of who would notice. He did not soften the move. He did not justify it. He chose protection over control. And felt the burn immediately. Resistance hardened. Silence grew sharp. The empire reacted the way living things did when injured, not collapsing but recoiling. Loyalty clarified itself with brutal efficiency. Those who had waited for hesitation found certainty instead. It would cost him. He had never doubted that. What surprised him was the absence of regret. Ifunanya sensed the change not as safety, but as gravity. The protection around her solidified, no longer tentative, no longer adjustable. Whatever had been decided had closed behind her like a door she had not touched. She understood then that the danger had not passed, had been chosen. And somewhere between power and consequence, between control and protection, something irreversible took shape. The choice burned. But Kang-ho did not look away. Silence did not return the way it had left. It lingered differently now. No longer protective, no longer passive. It carried weight, shaped by decisions that could not be reversed. Ifunanya felt it in the steady calm that followed the storm, the kind that arrived not because danger was gone, but because it had settled into place. Her days were no longer defined by disappearance. She moved through the city with awareness sharpened by truth. She did not shrink, but she did not pretend freedom had returned unchanged. The protection around her was real. So was its cost. She understood now that safety was never neutral. It was an exchange. What surprised her was not the visibility, but the clarity. She no longer wondered whether she was being watched. She assumed it and adjusted accordingly. The fear that once kept her small lost its edge when named. In its place grew something steadier. Not confidence, not defiance, but choice. She could decide how to move within the light that found her. Kang-ho watched the aftermath with the same restraint he had always practiced, though it no longer served him in quite the same way. His empire remained intact but altered. Power reasserted itself around him, firmer in some places, stripped bare in others. The illusion of effortless dominance was gone. He had traded it willingly. Those who remained near him understood the shift. Authority was still absolute, but it was no longer distant. It carried consequence that reached inward as well as out. Kang-ho accepted that without resentment. Control had once protected him from cost. Protection had taught him its value. He did not seek Ifunanya out unnecessarily. He did not explain what had been lost or gained. Their connection did not need language to exist. It was defined by the space that had opened between silence and action. They stood on opposite sides of that space, aware of one another without possession or debt. Ifunanya no longer mistook invisibility for freedom. Kang-ho no longer mistook control for invulnerability. Neither had escaped untouched. The city continued as it always had. Crowded, indifferent, alive with movement. People crossed paths every day without consequence. But some crossings left marks beneath the surface, altering trajectories in ways no one else could see. This had been one of them. Ifunanya stepped forward into her life with eyes open, carrying both protection and agency. Kang-ho remained where he was, ruling an empire reshaped by a choice he would not undo. Silence had broken. What replaced it was not peace, but understanding. And both of them moved on, changed, aware, and permanently beyond who they had been before.